Baruch Hashem Yahweh, and Shabbat Shalom, everybody, and Shabbat Shalom to our internet audience that's joining us. We're very excited about the developments that are happening here at the ministry, and I'm excited to get into the Torah Parsha this week. This week's Torah Parsha comes to us from Shemot, and it is entitled Va'era. Comes to us from Exodus chapter 6, and it extends through chapter 9 and verse 35. Now our Torah Parsha, it's going to recount the plagues that were inflicted upon the Mitzrayim, upon the Egyptians, when Pharaoh refused to let us go. Let us go. And for the last generation, those of us that are in the nations, we are in Egypt. We are in Mitzrayim. Just look around at the architecture that I speak about, it seems, each and every week. I mean, it gets more and more Egyptian, whether it's being in the schools, in the government, in the architecture, and all around us. We are scattered in the nations, but we are slaves, literally, in Mitzrayim, Egypt. But Yahweh's going to deliver us from the world and lead us where? We have a hope. He's going to lead us into biblical Israel, the promised land, and that's what we're waiting for. So this week's Torah portion, it builds and it builds and it builds, and its culmination, of course, is Joshua is going to lead us into the land. Is going to lead Israel home, and the prophecies, of course, build to Yeshua. All of the prophecies, they build to Yeshua leading Israel home as a nation and as a kingdom of priests. It's triumphant. I love the book of Shemot, the book of Exodus, because it is where we are today. It is where we are today. But just as in our Torah Parsha, we're going to have to endure some things just like the children of Israel endured. We're going to have to endure plagues, are we not? We're going to have to endure cosmic disturbances. And we're going to ultimately triumph how? By our own strength and by our own might? No way. We are going to triumph ultimately by placing the blood of the Lamb upon the doorposts and the lintels of our levim, of our hearts. That's the only triumph that you have, is in Yeshua. So we can see that it will ultimately culminate in our life, as the prophets say, with what's called or known as the greater Exodus. Jeremiah talks about it, and we need to be preparing for that. So in the book of Exodus, the book of Shemot, there are 3 times 3 plagues with a final judgment, totaling 10 in all. But for us, in this last generation, there will be 3 sets of 7 way more severe judgments and a greater exodus. So, as Rav Shaliach Shaul said to the Corinthians, we need to learn, 1 Corinthians 10, from our forefathers' mistakes, that we don't make the same mistakes. As they passed through the water, that they went into the wilderness with the murmuring, that we need to not make those same mistakes. It's really a refiner's fire, and that's what we're looking into. What are the keys to our exodus? What are the keys to our deliverance? Passover, that's the key. That's the key to our deliverance. And how we understand Passover and the Master's table is key. Can you see that in the scripture? That was how they began their deliverance, was the Passover. And it's no different with us. So we're going to have to look into that and examine that. Yahweh's altar, that's key to deliverance as well. Yahweh's altar, because that's how Yahweh's going to judge the world's systems with his fiery judgment. What altar are we going to be looking to? What altar are we going to go up to? What is an altar? What are we talking about? We need to understand the difference between dogma and truth. And that's what this ministry is doing, is trying to unravel the difference between dogma and truth. And we're all on a search. We need to understand too that some were created for destruction. And that's hard for us. In a world where everything has to be fair, Yahweh is not fair. We serve an Elohim who is unfair. Let me be clear and clear and clear about that. I hear it every single day. That's not fair. Thankfully, I don't hear it from my children. I hear it at the school I run. That's not fair. You're right. We don't operate in the realm of fairness here. We operate in the realm of work and reward. You see, Yahweh is unfair, because if he was fair, then we would all be burning right now, would we not? That would be fair. That would be just. But Yahweh is full of rachamim, mercy. So we know that some were created for destruction and some for glory. Some were created for destruction and some were for glory. And it all depends on what? What is the determining factor on whether you were created for destruction or for glory? Your lev, your heart. Now, I'm not saying, like we all used to say back in the church, but in my heart. No, I'm not saying that. But what we will see with Pharaoh, because we just, finished getting through Christmas, right? And everybody, you try to communicate with them, and it's always you get, but in my, oh my God, in your bloody heart, right? So I'm not talking about that. What I'm talking about is you will see that Yahweh deals with Pharaoh's heart, and the condition of his heart determines whether he is going to be destroyed or he's going to have an opportunity for teshuvah. So let's look in chapter 6, our opening text, verse 2. And Elohim spoke to Moshe. And this is a mild rebuke right here. The Hebrew word deber. And he said to him, I am Yahweh, and I appeared to Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov in as El Shaddai, but by my name Yahweh, was I not known to them? You see, the patriarchs, they did know Yahweh's by his name. If you look back in the Bereshit, Genesis, you see the name Yod-Heh Vav-Heh. So they did know him by Yahweh. But here, Yahweh's going to do something distinctly different. He's going to manifest himself more fully to Moshe. How? As El Shaddai. He's going to manifest himself not just as Yod-Heh Vav-Heh, but as El Shaddai. Because El Shaddai, he performed miracles that didn't disrupt nature. But Moshe is going to see him in even more fullness. He's actually going to disrupt nature, show mercy, salvation, and deliverance. So Moshe Rabbeinu is going to see more of the fullness of Yahweh. He's going to see more of his fullness, where he's actually disrupt nature. Now the patriarchs didn't experience that. Look at verse 4. And I have also established my brit with them, my covenant with them, to give them the land of Canaan, the land of their pilgrimage, where they were gerim. They were strangers. And I have also heard the groaning of the children of Israel, whom the Mitzrim, the Egyptians, keep in bondage. And I have remembered my covenant. Now we're going to get to the 7 I wills of Yahweh. We're going to talk about his attributes, and this connects to the Passover and the Passover cups. Therefore, say to the children of Israel, I am Yahweh, and I will bring you out. And in this text right here, in this narrative, this is where we get the Passover cups. Come from this text. The first one is the cup of sanctification, is it not? That's the first cup that you drink at Pesach. And that is Yahweh bringing us out of something. Therefore say to the children of Israel, I am Yahweh, and I will bring you out. I'm going to sanctify you. That's our first step from slavery, is separation. And I believe that begins with the Shabbat, and then starting to separate from all of the pagan holidays. And you start to sanctify yourself with the Shabbat and the feasts of Yahweh. Then you start to sanctify your body temple, and you start to eat what is food. You see, this is about coming out of something and going into something better. In fact, it's about becoming a Hebrew. Heva, crossing over from one soil to a better soil that produces more bountiful fruit. And that's really what we're doing. No different than the patriarch himself, Abraham. From under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you. That second cup of the Pesach, of course, is the cup of deliverance. The cup of deliverance. Deliver you out of their bondage, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm. This is Yeshua's cup. This is the third cup of the Passover, Yeshua's cup, the cup of redemption, where Yahweh will redeem us with an outstretched arm. And with great mishpatim, judgments, and I will take you to me for a people. That means that's that fourth cup of the Passover, which Yeshua said he wouldn't drink until we came into his kingdom presence with him, because this is the cup of praise. It's about taking his people into the kingdom as a bride. And Yeshua said he's going to wait to drink with us. And I will be your Elohim, and you shall know that I am Yahweh your Elohim, who brings you out from under the burdens of the Mitzrayim. And I will bring you into the land concerning which I did swear to give to Abraham, to Yitzhak, and to Yaakov. And I will give it to you for a heritage. I am Yahweh. These are the 7 I wills of Yahweh. Inclusive the 4 cups of the Passover. We can see that the beginning of our redemption, the beginning of our moving out of the world system, and the beginning of us moving out of slavery, coming into freedom is what? It has to be sanctification and the entrance into Passover. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 verse 14. It is written, therefore, my dearly beloved, flee from what? Idolatry. You see, we've grown up all around it that we can't even tell until Yahweh starts to prompt us. He says, flee, my dear beloved, from idolatry. Are those who eat of the sacrifices partakers of the altar? Are they? And look at verse 20 of 1 Corinthians 10. The things that the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to Shedim, demons, and not to Eloah. And I would not that you should have chavorah with Shedim. Yahweh doesn't want us to have friendship with demons. And that's all of this stuff in the world. It's all connected to demonology. The politics, the religions, all connected to demonology. But we've got names for it today, and we medicate for it. But there's nothing new under the sun. Verse 21, you cannot drink, listen to this, you cannot drink the Kiddush cup of Yahweh and the cup of Shedim. You cannot be partakers of Yahweh's Shulchan table and the Shulchan of Shedim. So right here, Rav Shaliach Shaul is talking to the Corinthians, and he's telling them something. You're messing around with the cup of demons, and then you want to come and partake of the Passover. He said, you can't do that. You cannot, Yeshua said, you cannot serve 2 masters. Oh, but Matthew, this is a long time ago. We don't do any of that today. Oh, really? Oh, really? I used to do it to soft lighting in the strum of an acoustic guitar on a Sunday morning pre-church service. And I didn't know, because they told me I was doing something else, and I didn't question. 2 Maccabees chapter 6 verse 5 talks about Dionysus. The altar was laden with unclean victims, prohibited by the law. It was no longer allowed to celebrate the Sabbath or observe the customs of our ancestors, or even to declare oneself a Jew. But on the contrary, they were led by bitter necessity to celebrate the king's birthday. with a monthly sacrifice. And when the feast of Dionysus came, they were also forced to follow the Dionysus procession and wear floral wreaths of ivy. You see, Dionysus was the god of the grape harvest, wine making and wine and cheer, the son of Zeus. And to the Romans, Dionysus was none other than Bacchus. And they Bacchus, the Romans did. They worshipped Bacchus on his day, Sol Invictus Mithras, Sunday. And they worshipped Bacchus on a Sunday, and they would have a Sunday sunrise service at the Tiber River in Rome, where they would have a small sun disk wafer, slaughter a child, drain the blood of the child, offer it up to Bacchus, and dip the sun disk wafer in the blood of the child, and they would have an offering. I thought we were told to come and have communion, but in reality we were doing the offerings of Dionysus and Bacchus, which got incorporated into the Roman Catholic Church, and they sold it to us as something about set apartness and holiness, when it is exactly the opposite. It's a profanity. How did we get caught up? How did we get caught up in such things? Because we didn't question. Once a week, Sunday morning at the Tiber River, they would slaughter a child, they would drain its blood, they would take a sun disk wafer, they would dip it in the child's blood, and they would have a service to Bacchus, which was none other than Dionysus. This is what the Romans did, and that got incorporated into the Roman Catholic Church. It's astounding to me. It's astounding to me, the counterfeit. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 25. After the same manner, he, Yeshua, also took the Kiddush cup, after he had eaten, saying, "This cup of Gelulah, rejoicing, is the Brit Hadashah in my dam." So this is the third cup of redemption that Yeshua is talking about. "This do as often as you drink it in remembrance of me." The question to ask is, how often would you celebrate the Passover? Yeshua gives us instruction through the Apostle Paul. You drink this when? Look what it says. "This is the Gelulah, the cup of rejoicing of the Brit Hadashah in my blood. This do as often as you drink it in remembrance of me." How often would you drink the third cup of redemption? Once a year. That is the cup of redemption that should be drunk once a year. How often is communion? Once a year, when you drink of that cup. How we got caught up in that weekly thing was Bacchus and Dionysus. But the scripture tells us that we come to the Passover once a year, where we drink of Yeshua's cup, the third cup of redemption. "Whoever drinks this cup of the Master Yahweh unworthily," meaning he's going to come to Passover and he's still monkeying around with the Sunday morning sunrise nonsense, "shall be guilty of the body and the dam, the blood of the Master Yahweh, and he drinks damnation on himself." To him who knows it is sin, like now all of you, and all of you online now, it is sin. Now, the deceptive spirits that are out there, because I got moved with emotion when you down, you get some guy up there with the acoustic guitar. I'm discipled, I'm coming before service on a Sunday morning at Calvary Chapel, and my heart, and But that just shows you that we're not to be ruled by our emotions in the spiritual realm, are we not? We are to be ruled by the word of Yahweh, because demons can work through our emotions, because our heart is fully wicked above all things. Who can trust it? Right? Before this Passover comes up, this is 2015. Before this Passover comes up, all double-mindedness, it's got to end. It has to end. It's either all or nothing. It's either all or nothing. Get in or get out of Shabbat. Get in or get out of the feast of Yahweh. Get in or get out of what's fit and proper to put in your body. In or out. But all of this monkeying around in the middle of the fence, it's just not going to work. It's get in or get out. We don't have time to mess around. Either partake of Yeshua's cup or go and mess around with the cup of demons. But don't do both and come to the master's table. In or out? In or out? And do you know how many messianics still mess around with that cup? Still. Because they haven't been instructed. Don't know where it comes from. Don't know what the Romans were doing down by the Tiber River to Bacchus on a Sunday morning at sunrise, which came from Dionysus. It's amazing. Rav Shaliach Shaul said what? He said, be crucified in Mashiach. How the heck can we be crucified with Mashiach if we don't even bother showing up at the Passover Seder? Can you explain that to me? You have got to present yourself at Passover. He says, eat my flesh and drink my blood. How can you do that if you don't show up at Passover? You see, the cup that Yeshua drank, that third cup of redemption, was a cup that establishes our covenant. We need to drink of that. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 26. If we sin willfully, that means we deliberately transgress his Torah instruction. After that we have received the knowledge of truth, after we've received Yeshua, there remains no more sacrifice for sins, because Yeshua is our what? Our final sin sacrifice. He's our final sin sacrifice. But a certain fearful anticipation of judgment and fire, which shall devour his enemies. Now, you've got to watch out for the bacon, lettuce, and tomato translation, the NLT or the BLT, and the nearly inspired version, because there is some willful, high-handed translation deception going on with the next verse that I'm going to read. Because if you actually even read it in the Greek, it says something different than how they translate it. He that despises Moshe's Torah dies. The Greek word there is apathnesko. It means about to die, ongoing. But you read it in some of the translation, they make it died, past tense. It's not going to affect you. This is something in the past. No, this is about you, this is about me, and this is about if you mess around, this judgment comes on you. This is ongoing, but they mistranslate it and they put it in the past tense. When the Greek word here, it's about ongoing future. It's happening. It's on. You mess with this cup, I'm fed up right now because I was lied to for a decade. My emotions, my heartstrings were pulled for a decade. That should make you upset. And you know what? Telling the truth is liberating, is it not? It's liberating, unless you're like, well, I kind of enjoyed those wafers. He that despises Moshe's Torah dies, ongoing, about to die, without rachamim, under 2 or 3 witnesses. Of how much worse a punishment do you think he shall deserve, who has trampled underfoot the Son of Yahweh, and has counted the dam of the Brit, by which he was made kadosh, as a common thing, and has insulted the ruach of favor. You see, altars are what sanctify the gift. It's the altars that sanctified the gift. If Yeshua wasn't put on an altar, then he was just another innocent man that was condemned to death. But the fact that he was put on the altar of Abraham tells us that his gift meant something, right? I mean, I can go out in the parking lot and I can go and kill a lamb, and all that means is I'm having lamb chops for dinner. But if I go and put that lamb up on an altar, that established that's something different than lamb chops, right? You see, it's the altar that is greater than the gift. Christian theology is that the gift, it's all about the gift, it's all about the gift, it's all about the gift. It doesn't matter. You can just kick out the altars of Abraham, the blood of Yeshua can fall on the ground and you trample it underfoot with your greasy grace. That's not what the Bible teaches. The Bible teaches that the altar is greater than the gift, that you have to honor the altar. That's why this ministry consistently teaches about the altar, because that is going to determine how you end up. It's so important. It's so important with all the ramblings that are going on in Zionist Israel right now, how we approach the altar, which altar, where. Let's continue. The altar is greater than the sacrifice. Matthew 23, verse 19. Yeshua's words, not mine. Leave it or lump it. That's what I say. You see, you kick out the covenant altars of Abraham, and the blood of the covenant falls to the ground, and you desecrate it with either your lawlessness or with your Levitical state. Either way, lawlessness or a Levitical state desecrates the altars of Abraham. How? By trampling the blood of Yeshua underfoot and counting it as a common thing. You see, listen to this. This is very important, what I'm about to say. Only the altars of Abraham sanctify the new covenant. That's it. Only the altars of Abraham sanctify the new covenant. That's why we go to the land of Moriah, to one of the mountains. Levitical altars do not sanctify the blood of the new covenant. It's only Abraham's altar that sanctifies and establishes the covenant. The book of the covenant and now the new covenant. If you turn to Genesis chapter 22 and you read what the actual word says, it says, take your son to the land of Moriah, to one of the mountains. It doesn't say take him to Mount Moriah, does it? That's what Judaism teaches you. That Abraham took Isaac to Mount Moriah. It doesn't say that. It says take your son to the land of Moriah, to one of the mountains. Now, which mountain? Is it going to be the mountain of Moriah, which is a stone threshing floor? A threshing floor is where you throw down grain, where you crush it and you thresh it. All it is a bare stone rock. Or is it going to be the mountain of olives in the land of Moriah, where there are thickets that a ram could get caught in? You see, Abraham's altar was always what became the red heifer altar, the paraduma altar, the altar outside of the gates where Yeshua was sacrificed. That's the altar Hebrews tells us in the 13th chapter and the 10th verse that we're to go to. Because Abrahamic altars are the only altars that establish the new covenant, not Levitical ones. And this is the most important teaching for me. And I know everybody says, well, this is the most important teaching. As for me, it ministers so deeply to me because I got caught up in the deception, as many of you have. And I am so thankful for Yahweh for turning me around and showing me his word. In true humbleness, Yeshua had to die on Abraham's altar, not a Levitical altar. Let's turn back to our text and go back to chapter 6, verse 9 of the book of Shemot. Chapter 6, verse 9. And Moshe spoke this to the children of Israel, but they listened not to Moshe because of their anguish of ruach and cruel bondage. The Hebrew word there is croissant. Not croissant. I mean, I'd like a croissant. But croissant, which means stiff-necked. They didn't hear and they didn't obey Moshe because they were impatient of ruach and they were stiff-necked in their service. And that's the state of religion today. Impatient of ruach and stiff-necked in their service. And Yahweh spoke to Moshe, say, go in, speak to Pharaoh, Melech of Mitzrayim, so that he lets the children of Israel go out of the land. And Moshe spoke before Yahweh, saying, see, the children of Israel have not listened to me. How then shall Pharaoh listen to me, I who am of uncircumcised lips? Now this always troubled me. And I was like, what exactly does that mean? And then I started to read the book of Yasher. Now in the 70th chapter of Yasher, it explains to you how Moshe became uncircumcised of lips. Now what happened, Moshe, I believe he was about 3 years old, and he was in Pharaoh's court. And he was sitting in Pharaoh's court with Balaam and his 2 sons, the magicians. And Moshe Rabbeinu, being 3 years old, he reached over and he grabbed the crown off of Pharaoh's head and he put it upon his head. And Balaam said, see, this Hebrew, it's prophesied he's going to take the crown and the kingdom from you. We should spill his blood now. Balaam then said, let's bring in some counselors to make sure that this decision is right. So then they bring in some counselors, but the Malach of Yahweh comes disguised as one of the counselors. And they set up this situation in the book of Yasher. And they say, the Malach says, they describe this situation, that an onyx stone is going to be brought before Moshe Rabbeinu, and a red hot coal is going to be brought before Moshe Rabbeinu. If he reaches out and touches the onyx stone, then that means that he deliberately, willfully wanted to take the crown and the kingdom from Pharaoh. But if he reaches out and he touches the fiery coal, then that means it was unintentional and he should live. So Moshe Rabbeinu, 3 years old, reaches out, just about to touch the onyx stone, and the Malach of Yahweh guides his hand to the hot coal. He touches the hot coal, puts it to his lips, and he becomes burnt in the mouth, burnt in the tongue, and circumcised of speech. It's a great account. And as you read the book of Yasher, it parallels with Bereshit and Shemot. And it's a phenomenal account that brings a lot more insight and support to the scriptural account. That's in the book of Yasher, chapter 70. That's why Moshe Rabbeinu was uncircumcised in the lips. Let's continue on in the 6th chapter and the 16th verse. And these are the names of the sons of Levi according to their generations: Gershon, Kehath, Merari. And the years of Chaim of Levi were 137 years. The sons of Gershon, Libni and Shimni, according to their mishpocha, family, and the sons of Kehath, Amram and Izhar, and Hebron and Uziel, and the years of Chaim, the life of Kehath, were 133 years. And listen to this in the 18th verse. And the sons of Kohath, now of course Kohath is from Levi, and Amram, that's from Moshe, came from Amram. There is no way, when you look at this text, there is no way that the children of Israel were in Egypt for 400 or 430 years. That's commonly taught in Christianity. They were in slavery for 400 or 430 years. Look at the genealogy in Exodus chapter 6. There is no way that they were in Egypt for 400 or 430 years. They were in Mitzrayim, in Egypt, for 210 years. Now we're going to have to break this down, because we're going to see how this Melchizedek covenant promise, how it was orchestrated. And we'll see how the 430-year prophecy, what it really means. Because it's not about them being in slavery in Egypt for 400 or 430 years. But they were in Egypt for 210 years. But it was 400 years since the promise was given to Abraham, and 30 years was allotted to Bnei Ephraim, to the house of Ephraim, who perished in the wilderness. Because what it says back in Genesis chapter 15 at the covenant between the pieces is that the iniquity would be for how many generations? 4 generations. What we're going to see now is the children of Ephraim, they left Egypt after 180 years in slavery. They miscalculated, much like we are today. The house of Joseph, the children of Ephraim, are we not all about trying to work out the calculations of Yahweh's feasts and festivals? And there are, I don't know how many calendars, how many different feast days. Everybody's got a different timeline. Nothing new under the sun. The children of Ephraim, they anticipated their slavery, and they left 30 years too soon. And they were mighty men of valor, it says in the book of Yasher, and they were strong men, and they marched out of Egypt in the 180th year, instead of waiting to 210 years for the full 400-year prophecy. But they marched out 30 years early. They didn't bring any provisions with them, and they got hungry, and they came across the children of Gath. And they went down and they wanted to buy, with the gold and the silver that they brought out, they wanted to buy food from the children of Gath, and the children of Gath wouldn't give it to them. So they went to war with the children of Gath, but the children of Gath called up the Philistines. And they said, hey, we've got to take care of these children of Israel because they're trying to take our sheep. The whole of the tribe of Ephraim, I think less 10, was slaughtered, house of Ephraim, by the children of Gath and the Philistines. I'm going to break this 430-year prophecy down because there's been so much teaching about this, and it comes from the Christian church. Not to dog on the Christian church, but we really do need to clean up our house, and we need to understand what the Bible says, not what the religions and traditions of men say. So let's look into this 430-year prophecy that has often been misconstrued to say that the children of Israel were in slavery in Egypt for 430 years. In the book of Acts it says, I believe, 400 years. What is going on? Because I just said 210 years. So somebody's not telling you the truth. Bereshit, Genesis chapter 15, verse 13. And he said to Avram, know of a certainty that your Zerah seed shall be Gerim, strangers in a land that is not theirs. And they shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterwards shall they come out with great substance. And you shall go to your avot, your fathers in Shalom, and you shall be buried in a tov old age, a good old age. But in the 4th generation, they shall come here again. Why? For the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. You see, the Amorites, they were the Nephilim. They were the children of the Watchers. They were the mixture of the daughters of men and the Watchers. They were the Nephilim, the offspring of the Watchers, and the sins of the fathers had to be passed down through that mutant line for how many? Yahweh says that he will visit the sins of the fathers to the... Exactly. So Yahweh has to be true to his character, to his attribute. Yahweh's 13 attributes. Yahweh, Yahweh Elohim, merciful, gracious and long-suffering, abounding in goodness and truth, who extends mercy to thousands, forgiver of iniquity, transgression, and sin, but by no means clears the guilty, but he visits the sins, even to the Amorites, down to the third and fourth generation. But he extends mercy to those who love him. That's Yahweh's character, and he's even going to do it to his enemies. So that is why it says in that text, and I always wondered what that meant back in the Calvary Chapel days, and nobody had an answer for me. It means that these Nephilim, they're even going to be given 4 generations for that iniquity to go down, and then they're going to be wiped out. Yahweh letting it fully manifest before the judgment. Isn't that amazing? And it came to pass that when the sun went down and it was dark, see, a smoking furnace and a burning lamp that passed between those pieces. In the same day Yahweh made a brit, a covenant with Abraham, saying, to your Zerah, your seed, have I given this land, from the river of Mitzrayim to the great river, the river Euphrates, and the land of the Kenites. So right here, from this promise, you have 400 years till their deliverance. But 30 years was allotted for the children of Ephraim because they left 30 years early. And that's why sometimes in the scripture you see 400 years, sometimes you see 430. Turn with me to Exodus, Shemot, chapter 12, verse 40. I love the word of Yahweh. I mean, it is amazing. It is like a treasure chest. Exodus, Shemot, chapter 12, verse 40. Now the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Mitzrayim was 430 years. Now you've got your allotment for Ephraim. And it came to pass at the end of 430 years, even on the very same day. Now what's Yahweh talking about? The very same day as what? Even on the very same day of their entry, it came to pass that all the divisions of Yahweh went out from the land of Mitzrayim. The promise of the 400 years was given Bereshit at Passover. If you read the text of Genesis chapter 17 verse 21, if you read the text of Genesis chapter 18 verse 6, and if you read the text of Genesis chapter 19 verse 3, you see matzah, unleavened bread, matzah, unleavened bread, cakes, unleavened cakes. The time of the prophecy was Passover, because Yahweh is omnipotent, excuse me. Hello. Look what it says in Acts chapter 7 verse 6. And Eloah spoke, saying, this his Zerah, that his Zerah seed should sojourn in a strange land, and that they should bring them into bondage and mistreat them with evil 400 years. So now we got 400 years. See, the writer right here not allotting for the tribe of Ephraim. And the nation to whom they shall be in bondage will I judge, said Yahweh. And after that they shall come out and serve me in this place. And he gave him a brit of Brit Milah. He gave him a covenant of circumcision. And so Abraham brought out Yitzhak and performed Brit Milah on him on the 8th day. You see, what we can't do, which we have done, is we cannot divorce the narrative from the covenant of promise. You see, once you divorce this narrative from the covenant of promise, then your timeline gets all messed up. And you'll end up like the children of Ephraim, and you'll try to force Yahweh's hand, and you'll try to leave, you're in slavery early. And we've seen that in the Hebrew roots or Messianic movement. People packing up, selling everything to move over to the land of Israel. Why? To get whacked when Israel gets burnt? from Ashkelon up to Tel Aviv and all the way through on the west coast. That would be too early, judgment and death. So the timing of our release is extremely important, because we have to wait for Yahweh's hand in biblical Israel, not Yahweh's hand judgment of Zionist state Israel, which is going to come first. You leave early, you'll get caught up in that judgment, and you won't make it into the biblical Israel land. You see? So this is what we have to remember. There is nothing new, and the children of Ephraim, they made this mistake. Let us not in this final generation, as the house of Joseph, the children of Ephraim, make the same mistake as our forefathers. We can't divorce the narrative from the covenant of promise, Genesis 12. That was the unconditional covenant of promise. We can't divorce the narrative from Genesis 15, the conditional part of the covenant between the pieces with the time allotment. And we can't divorce the narrative from Genesis 17, the covenant token sign. You see, Genesis 15, the covenant between the pieces with the time allotment, is the connecting rod between Genesis 12 and Genesis 17. Does that make sense? I'm not sure if you guys are tracking. Got some funny faces. So they were only, all that to say this, they were only in Egypt for 210 years. It was 400 years since the promise was given, with a 30-year allotment given for the children of Ephraim who left early. In fact, that's from Yasher chapter 75, where it talks about the children of Ephraim. They left in the 180th year, 30 years early, and they spoke and they ran into the children of Gath. That is where you get that 30-year add-on. Now let's turn into chapter 7, verse 8, and let's deal with something else that's often been misconstrued, and that is the serpent. Exodus chapter 7, verse 8. And Yahweh spoke to Moshe and to Aaron, saying, when Pharaoh shall speak to you, show a miracle for yourselves. Then you shall say to Aaron, take your rod and cast it before Pharaoh, and it shall become a serpent. The Hebrew word here is tanin. And Moshe and Aaron went into Pharaoh, and they did as Yahweh had commanded. And Aaron cast down his rod before Pharaoh and before his avadim, and it became a serpent, tanaim. Then Pharaoh also caused the wise men and the sorcerers and the magicians of the Mitzrayim, and they also did like manner with their enchantments. They cast down every man his rod, and they became tanaim, serpents, but Aaron's rod swallowed up their rods. What's going on here? I mean, traditionally we've been taught that they throw down their rods, Moshe Rabbeinu throws down his rod, and you end up with parlor games. And whose serpent is the biggest swallows the smallest, and there we have the game is won. But there's got to be more going on in the narrative. You see, Tanaim, the Hebrew word that appears here in the text, it's a very dubious word. And it appears in the Tanakh as either a whale, a dinosaur, can mean a dragon, it can mean a sea monster, a serpent, or a snake. So Moshe Rabbeinu threw down his staff and it became a whale. Moshe Rabbeinu threw down his staff and it became a dinosaur. But the text would, Tanaim would support that, because it's a very dubious word. But is that where Yahweh first instructed Moshe of what to do? It's not, is it? So if we want to go and find out the truth of what's happening in this situation, we want to use what's called the Torah of first mention, the law of first mention, and the instruction of where Yahweh told Moshe to do this thing was in the 4th chapter and in the 3rd verse. So let's go there and we'll find out what's really going on, because I don't believe it's parlor games. And he said to Moshe Rabbeinu, cast it on the ground. And he cast it on the ground and it became a serpent. The Hebrew word there is different. This is the Torah of first mention. The Hebrew word there is nachash. Nachash. And Moshe fled from before it. Nun chet shin. Nachash. It means foretelling, conjure, snake, metal, smooth, bronze, or copper. There's no dinosaur or whale in that one. There's no snake. There's no serpent. Well, there is snake, sorry. Foretelling, conjure, snake, metal, smooth, bronze, or copper. Now, let's turn to Numbers, Bar Midbar, Numbers chapter 21, verse 8. And Yahweh said to Moshe, make a fiery serpent and set it upon a pole, and it shall come to pass that everyone that is bitten, when he looks upon it, he shall live. Look and live. But if you look in your text, serpent isn't even in the text. It should be in italics if you have a reasonably honest translation. So the translators supplied the word serpent. It's not even in the text in Numbers chapter 21, verse 8. You see, the Hebrew word there is not nachash. It's not nachash from Exodus 4, verse 3. It's another Hebrew word in Numbers chapter 21, verse 8. And that Hebrew word is seraph. You know, like seraphim? What is the seraphim? The seraphim is Yahweh's fiery attendant of his altar. We're going back to altars again. Shin Resh Fei. It's a seraphim of brass that Moshe Rabbeinu lifts up, which connects with the Torah of first mention of Nakash, because it could mean a brass thing. Nakash could mean a brass thing. It was a seraphim of brass that Moshe makes in Numbers chapter 21, verse 8. Now, if you connect that with Isaiah, Yeshayahu chapter 6, verse 2, above it stood seraphim. Each one had 6 wings, and 2 he covered his face, and 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. So what's going on in our biblical narrative? What was Moshe Rabbeinu doing? Moshe Rabbeinu throws down his staff and it turns into a seraphim of bronze. It turns into Yahweh's fiery attendant of his altar. Judgment. Yahweh is judging using his fiery attendant of Isaiah 6:2. He is judging the Egyptians' various bronze gods that they served. They're not playing parlor tricks, whose snake's the biggest. It is somewhere where Yahweh is throwing down his judgment, and he is using his seraphim as brass, his fiery attendant, to judge the Egyptians' various bronze gods. Later in the book of Numbers, Moshe Rabbeinu makes a seraphim of bronze, just as he did right there in the book of Shemot. Isn't that amazing? It's about Yahweh judging the various bronze gods of the Egyptians, which is all about these plagues. It's all about Yahweh's altar and his fiery attendant. Let's talk about the hardness of heart, because what we know in the text, in the 13th verse of chapter 7 of the book of Shemot, that Yahweh hardened Pharaoh's lev, his heart, so that he listened not to them. And as Yahweh he said, and Yahweh said to Moshe, Pharaoh's lev is hardened. He refuses to let the people go. The hard lev of Pharaoh. In chapter 7, verse 3, the Hebrew word used for the hardening is kahash. Kahash. In chapter 10, verse 1, another Hebrew word, kabad, is used. But in all other 8 cases, the Hebrew word for hardening is chazak. Chazak. And it means strengthened. You see, all Yahweh did, whatever was in Pharaoh's heart, Yahweh just strengthened it. And that's how he works with people. Whatever is in our hearts, Yahweh will strengthen it. That is how Yahweh deals with the heart. It's not how we say, oh, but in my heart. No. Yahweh will take what in your heart is, when it's all about you, and he'll strengthen it. And we come out with magazines called Us and We, and ultimately Oprah. Let's just name a magazine. I mean, my God. I mean, it tells you about the culture, doesn't it? Yahweh strengthened her heart, did he not? Wild stuff. There's a lesson for us that whatever Pharaoh's heart was inclined to do, Yahweh merely strengthened it. And whatever our hearts are inclined to do, Yahweh will merely strengthen it. Yahweh strengthened his inclination, whether it was good, whether it was evil, to show the condition of the heart. Thus you see in Joshua chapter 24, verse 23. Let me read that. Joshua. Therefore he said, put away the foreign gods which are among you, and incline your heart to Yahweh Elohim of Israel. That's ultimately what it's about. Putting away the foreign gods and inclining our heart to Yahweh. He can strengthen that. How can that happen if we get caught up in all of the paganism? And there are some teachers right now that won't even use that word because you know what? It's too divisive. I mean, well, when is it appropriate to use that word then? When I walk past these things. If it's not pagan, times are changing. Where even teachers are backtracking. And teachers that once were all about, that's pagan! Now say, we don't want to use that word anymore. It's really divisive. Well, yeah. It is. And that's what Yahweh said that he came. Yeshua came to bring a sword. To divide. To separate. To sanctify and set us apart as a kadosh, holy nation of people that would stand up and say, that's pagan! I've said that many times. We didn't actually say that, but that's kind of my interpretation of it. It's what I scream all the time when I go to Starbucks and get my coffee. Actually, my son does that. Papa, I don't want to tell stories on him. He's going to grow up here one day and he's like, you're going to have to take all that stuff down off the internet because I'm trying to find a wife. Let's look at the plagues. In Bereshit, we saw how Abel's blood cried out to convict Cain. But here in our text, the blood of the male Israelite children cries out from the Nile to convict Pharaoh. And the plague of frogs, what does that do? It testifies against Pharaoh's demand of the midwives to murder innocent children. You see, the frog was associated with the Egyptian god Het. That Het was the frog-faced goddess who, according to the ancients, was the goddess of the midwives. And Yahweh said, we're going to judge that god. Yahweh begins the plagues with just a touch of his finger, chapter 8, verse 19. And then he moves on to his full hand, chapter 9, verse 3. And finally, the deliverance is accomplished with his outstretched arm that is spoken of in chapter 6, verse 6. You see, Yahweh is manifesting more and more of his majesty over the pantheon of the Egyptian Elohim. And that's what's going to happen in our nation. That's what's going to happen in the Yahweh is going to manifest more and more of his majesty, but he needs a majestic people to do that. That means you have to be kingly. That means you have to be royal. That means you have to be takers of a priesthood. You see, the 10 plagues typify the 10 plagues that are really plaguing us in this generation. What's plaguing the 10 tribes of Israel that are scattered in the nations? What's plaguing us while we're in slavery and captivity? Well, there's blood in our diet. There's frogs in our medicine. There's lice in your bed. There's flies in your soup. Hormones and GMOs in your beef. Your medicine is poisoning you. The sky is falling and locusts are coming. What's plaguing us? The Hebrew word for locusts, I'll go on a rabbit trail right now, is arbe. Arab is a play on words of locusts, arbe. Arab swarms are coming. Arab swarms of locusts are coming. Dark eclipses are on our horizon this year, are they not? And finally, the New World Order starts its depopulation plan laid out on the Georgia Guidestones. Oh, it's coming. I'm not going to have the fear of man and try and be all peaceful and all like, oh, you don't want to upset the boat. You know, your ministry, if you do that, it's not going to be good for your ministry. The ministry is the people that are searching for truth. We're in this together. We are the ministry. You and I, we are together as the ministry. The ministry isn't like a building. The ministry isn't like some worldly thing. It's the people. And if we're not searching for the truth, then we don't have a ministry. There's nothing to be afraid of. I don't understand why people get so far and then they draw back. You just got to keep on pursuing the things of Yahweh. We're experiencing the escalation of the locust arbe Arab armies, and it's in our bloody midst. Arabs, arbe as in Arabian or the Sassarans. The Strong's number is Hebrews 694 Arab from Hebrews 693. It means to lurk, to lay in wait, to ambush. It's a fitting description of how they work against the world as terrorists, is it not? How can you be at war with terrorists when terrorists is an action? It's a description. Terrorism is an action. You're not defining things correctly. It's like being at war against fighting. We're at war against fighters. Well, what does that mean? Because nobody wants to call it for what it is. They sneak, they lurk around, and they are swarming around the world today, and it's only going to increase to apocalyptic proportions. Revelation chapter 9 and Revelation chapter 13. I want to give you some commentary from a commentary of the critical and explanatory of the whole Bible in 1871. This is from Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown. Among Mohammedans, Lord of the locusts, listen, Among Mohammedans, Lord of the Locusts is a title for Allah. That's from 81. In the early 700s, something happened. And what you saw in the past couple of weeks in France connects all the way back to it. But we don't know our history and we don't understand. Let me explain it to you. Because what happened outside of Paris, what happened in France in the recent weeks is connected back to the 700s. In the early 700s, after conquering the Iberian Peninsula, Islamic forces, they pushed north all the way up into a modern day France, just outside of the area that the atrocities happened last week. Initially, they met very little resistance until they reached just outside of Paris, a place called Tours. It's called the Battle of Tours, and it happened in 732 of the Common Era, right in the outskirts of Paris. You see, I've read the Quran, I've studied the Quran. My wife makes me keep it out in the barn. I'm not allowed to bring it into the house. And it says in the Quran that any territory that you have claimed for Allah, if it goes back into the hand of the infidel, then it is your obligation to regain every square mile, every inch of that territory. Otherwise, it is an insult to Allah. So what you have is that Islam pushed all the way up to Tours, Paris, just outside of Paris, and then the infidels pushed them back, defeated them in the Battle of the Tours in 732. So now, ever since then, Islam has got an obligation, according to the Quranic text, to push back, regain, and take that territory back. Otherwise, this is an insult to Allah. So what you had last week was the proclamation that that land has been taken back, and that is why France is going to fall. Unless there is a French Revolution. Now, there was almost going to be a revolution, because the police officer who was in charge of the investigation on the attack on the media center, he was aware of what was going on, what I've just described to you, what it says in the Quran and what it says about gaining that territory. The policeman who was in charge of the whole investigation was about to blow the whistle on what Islam is actually doing. And that would have caused the final French Revolution. And do you think they would let that happen? Tell me, do you think that the globalists would have let that happen? So what happened to that policeman? He mysteriously got depressed and he killed himself. Are you serious? 4 days after the incident, after he's deep into investigating it, he's discovering this, and he's like, I got to blow the whistle of it, and we know that there would be a final French Revolution, and guess what? He got depressed and he killed himself. End of story. End of story, my foot. What kind of world are we living in? There are 1.6 billion Muslims. That's 24% of the world's population. It's the fastest growing religion. 80% of them are not yet radicalized. But that means that 20% of them are radicalized. That's 300 million Muslims radicalized that want to kill you and kill me. There's 55 Muslim nations. And if Islam was a religion of peace, then why would not one of those 55 nations rise up and have peace in that nation? But each and every one of those 55 nations, they persecute believers in Yahweh. Every single one of them, of the 55 nations. There are 1,764 Islamic centers in the United States of America. "500 of those centers teach the sword verses of the Quran. 500 of those centers teach the sword verses of the Quran. The closest one to us is on Alaska in Washington State. The next closest one to us is in Oak Hill, California. And you wonder if the prophecies are going to come true about a 200 million man army in Revelation chapter 9 verse 13. It's happening right around us. But nobody wants to call it for what it is. We need to get ourselves prepared spiritually, physically, and emotionally, because the world is changing, and you're going to see the boiling pot's going to be France, because that is the area that has to be regained first. Very sobering. Very sobering. But we are living in a day and time where politicians have sold us into slavery. Sold us into slavery, not willing to warn the people. Look at the world that we're living in. Look at the world that we're living in. We're coming in right now in full swing into 2015. We have got the blood moons at Passover and Sukkot. If we look back to our Torah portion, what you'll see is that there are 3 sets plagues each. These 9 plagues are then followed by the most severe judgment of all, the death of the firstborn. And why was that? Why did Yahweh decide to do that? Well, firstly, because the Egyptians, what they would do, it tells us in the book of Jasher, that the Egyptians, Pharaoh put an edict out that when they took away the mortar and they had to go and find their own straw and they had to build their own bricks without all of the equipment, that if they were 1 brick deficient on the quota, then Pharaoh would take their youngest son and place them in the wall where the bricks were missing. You see, so Pharaoh was attacking the lastborn. Yahweh ultimately judged the firstborn. But what we see is this judgments on the plagues and the cycles of the plagues will connect to this year, 2015, with the blood moons of Passover and Sukkot. How do I mean that? Because there are 3 sets of 3 plagues each. These 9 plagues are then followed by the most severe judgment of all, the death of the firstborn. But I want to show you another pattern within these plagues that I believe shows the purpose of the blood moons of 2014 and 2015. Let's look at these 3 sets that we're going to. Set 1. Within each set, you're going to see 3 accounts. Set 1, number 1. Yahweh gives a warning by water, followed by the rivers turning to blood. Exodus chapter 7, verse 15. Then, the next thing that happens in set 1 is Yahweh brings a warning by the palace, followed by the plague of frogs. Exodus chapter 8, verse 1. Then finally, in set 1, there's no warning, but there's a plague of lice in Exodus chapter 8, verse 16. Now we move on to the second set. There's a warning by water, followed by a plague of swarms. Exodus chapter 8, verse 20. Second, there's a warning by the palace, followed by the plague upon the livestock. Chapter 9, verse 1. And then finally, the pattern continues. There's no warning. There's a plague of boils. Chapter 9, verse 8. Now we're getting into the third and final set of 3. There's a warning by water, followed by hail and fire. 9, verse 13. Then there's a warning by the palace, followed by a plague of locusts. Chapter 10, verse 1. And then there is no warning. Yahweh's done with warning. There's a plague of darkness. Chapter 10, verse 21. These are all followed by a final cataclysm. Judgment upon the firstborn. 6 warnings and 9 chastisements before the final cataclysm. That's the pattern. 6 warnings and 9 chastisements before the final cataclysm. I believe this connects to the day and age that we live in. The 6 warnings are the 4 blood moons and the 2 solar eclipses of 2014 and 2015. There's your 6 warnings. The 9 chastisements, well, some may look to the 9 harbingers written by Rabbi Jonathan Kahn. Many of you have read that, but be that as it may. Look around at the world events. It seems clear to me that we've had way more than 9 chastisements. Way more than 9 chastisements. And we need to have an awakened spirit ready for a final cataclysm. Not a slumbering spirit of apathy. Because is this year, is 2015 when these things begin to come to pass? Then look up and lift up your heads, for your redemption draweth nigh. You see, we have 3 series of 7 more severe judgments for a total of 21 judgments in our prophetic future in the book of Revelation. 1/4 of the world's population will die. Revelation chapter 6, verse 8. That's the 4th seal. Then 1/3 of the world's population will die. That means the world's population is decreased by 50% with just 2 plagues. 50% by just 2 plagues. And we've got 19 more to go. And you think it's time for a nice, soft, cushy message. It's all about protecting the ministry. No. It's not. It's a time for calling 1 from a village, 2 from a town. That's the time. That's the time that we live in. That's what this ministry is about. It's about calling 1 from a town, 2 from a city. And that's the fruit that we see, because nobody else gives a rip. They're asleep at the wheel. Okay. Keep on trucking. One-third of the sea is going to become blood. 1/3 of the sea creatures will die. And 1/3 of the ships are going to be destroyed. That's all with the second trumpet in Revelation chapter 8. Finally, we'll get some real bloody global warming. Not the stuff that Al Gore's manufactured, but we're really going to get some global warming. I mean, that day I'll be fine. Yeah, now you can talk to me about your global warming. But the worldwide warming that's coming, it's not going to be caused by Barack Obama's carbon emissions. The plague will come from the very hand of Yahweh himself in Revelation. And that will be the fourth bowl. See, we need to know Yahweh now. We need to know Yahweh now, not tomorrow. For today, the writer of Hebrews says, is the day of salvation. If you hear his voice, for it is today if you hear his voice. This says Yahweh, in this you shall know that I am Yahweh. See, I will smite with the rod that is in my hand upon the Maim. The Hebrew word there, mem, yod, mem. The yod symbolizing that the waters will be separated by the hand of Yahweh, which are in the river and shall be turned to blood. You see, the blood, it always symbolized the Egyptians' blood guilt for shedding innocent males' blood. And for Israel, it symbolizes the only Lamb of Yahweh that can save us if we apply the waters, the living waters of immersion in Yeshua's blood. And his blood can break us free from stagnant strongholds, which brings me all the way back to how I began. This year is a Passover of the blood moons. Don't get caught up in the pagan stuff of Bacchus and Dionysus. Don't get caught up in the world. It is a time of sanctification and renewal. Yahweh says, how can we testify to the crucified Mashiach if we don't even show up fit and proper and ready for his Pesach? It's time to set aside the traditions. It's time to set aside the emotional well-being of ourselves, but it's to press into Yahweh. Because these plagues, these times that the book of Shemot speaks about, these are the times that you and I live in. That's what Rav Shaliach Shaul spoke to the Corinthians in the 10th chapter. That not to fall for the same mistakes that Israel did, but to be ready. Because there is more than 200 million marching that want to see the destruction of the children of Yahweh. There's 300 million presently, growing each and every day exponentially. We need to realize that we have enemies within the camp, that within these nations' borders which aren't even secure. America has changed, and we need to change with it. Change our lifestyle to become biblical Israel, the people of Yahweh. That's your culture. That's your life. And that is your only salvation, is becoming the children of Israel and applying the blood of the Lamb to the doorposts of your heart. That's it. Because everything else is slavery. Slavery. And Yahweh has given us his Torah. He has given us his mitzvot so we can be prepared for the days that we live in. So we won't make the mistakes of the forefathers. It's a heavy message, but you know what? I would rather know the truth and be prepared than be lulled with a lullaby of the traditions of men. Amen? Do we have any questions, any comments? We may have some from our internet audience. If we do, we'll have Brother Sean, if you could pass around the microphone. Anybody, suggestions? A lot of information. A lot to think about.
Dane, you have a question?
Did I turn it on?
Is it on? Yeah.
Hey Matthew, when it came to Moses' circumcised lips, a lot of discussion of whether it was actually a speech impediment or was he just not worthy to carry the word of God, like Peter when he says, I'm a man of unclean lips?
That's a good, traditionally one would say that, uncircumcised lips, he wasn't prepared, he wasn't ready and equipped. Book of Yasha would explain that it was literally a speech impediment. So you have to weigh these things. It could possibly be both.
Also look at the burning coals of Isaiah.
The burning coals with Isaiah. Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, that's a great question. Anybody else? Questions, comments? Yes. Hang on a second here. He's gonna.
I have a suggestion for this wonderful couple that sits behind us, separated but side by side now. When we look at the letters of their names,